I'm really happy to be here to talk about offensive speech because that, seems to be a specialty of mine, although I don't set out to offend. People ask, do you do that deliberately? Do you set out deliberately to provoke? And the answer is no, I don't. I start with the premise that just because most people believe something to be true doesn't mean they're all wrong, but it's a good place to start. In my decade as a full-time columnist for the Globe, I've managed to offend such diverse groups as Muslims, creationists, feminists, Newfoundlanders, of course, teachers, students, elderly drivers, people who are fans of Sarah Palin, people who believe in repressed memory syndrome and satanic ritual abuse, people who like to buy carbon offsets, AIDS activists, pretty well runs the gamut. I don't think I've ever offended my mother, but I'm not at the end of my career yet. And last week, as you've heard, I managed to offend thousands of people by suggesting that the hunter-gatherer cultures of North American Aboriginal peoples 400 years ago were perhaps not quite as sophisticated as, for example, the European Renaissance. And I can tell you that that hurt a lot of people's feelings. And so there's been a write-in campaign to the paper by people denouncing me as at the very least ignorant and as the very worst a racist, as you heard, and demanding that I be fired and so on. But here's the thing about journalism, and especially about opinion writing, and that is that if you're doing your job properly, you're bound to give offense to someone. There's just no way around it. And there's no predicting what will give offense, or who will take offense, or how much offense they'll take. After I wrote that thing about Newfoundland a while back, and it was lighthearted, I sort of spun off a joke, what I thought was a joke. But Newfoundlanders didn't take it that way. 2,500 of them wrote angry emails to me, personally, demanding that I be boiled in seal oil. Danny Williams denounced me in the national media for an entire week. And even today, any journalist from Toronto who goes to Newfoundland has to explain right away that she does not know Margaret Wente. They have long memories there, as I discovered. Now, I have fear that any moment I'll be hauled off before some Human Rights Commission and put on trial for offensive speech. But I have one comfort, and that is that other aggrieved groups have recently tried this tactic and failed rather spectacularly. So I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to Ezra and to Mark Stein and McLean's, who've succeeded at great expense, I might add, in making human rights commissions look utterly ridiculous. Not that the problem with human rights commissions has been solved by any means, but for the time being, they'll probably go back to picking on helpless and obscure people rather than high-profile journalists like me. So, you know what happened with the Mark Stein case? I don't have to recap it, and I won't. Suffice it to say that the case was brought by people acting for the Canadian Islamic Council, which has been quite a vocal group for Muslim law students from Osgoode Hall, not exactly a disadvantaged and oppressed minority there, I don't think. First, they tried to shake down McLean's by demanding equal time, the same number of pages for a piece written by them of their choosing with their headlines and a cover that they would approve of, and also $10,000 donation to their group. Of course, Maclean's quite properly said, no. So how did we get here? Well, you've heard a pretty good explanation of that this morning. But I've been wondering, how did we get to the absurd situation in which a bunch of law students could take a major magazine before a bunch of human rights tribunals which would hear them out according to rules they seem to make up as they go along, known only to them, all paid for by the taxpayer? Well, Wayne McKay got at a lot of it this morning. We have collective rights. The U.S., for example, does not have collective rights. It's, they have something called the First Amendment. It's an American thing. The First Amendment, notice the position, first, is so strong that it guarantees groups like the KKK and neo-Nazis the right to march through the streets. When I was a kid, the march of the neo-Nazis through Skokie, Illinois, which was right next to where I grew up, was one of the things that I remember best. The First Amendment doesn't even allow false statements about racial or ethnic groups to be suppressed or punished just because they're false, just because they may increase the general level of prejudice. Canada, by contrast, as my friend Alan Waravoy, the General Counsel of the Canadian Civil Liberties Union, said, is a pleasantly authoritarian state. One lawyer for the BC Civil Liberties Association, which intervened in the Maclean's case, put it this way: Canadians do not have a cast iron stomach for offensive speech. We don't subscribe to a marketplace of ideas. Americans as a whole are more tough-minded, more prepared for verbal combat. An investigator for the Human Rights Commission, Canadian Human Rights Commission, explained it nicely, I think. Freedom of speech, he said, is an American concept, so I don't give it any value. Now, Canada has endured various challenges to speech throughout the years, and we've wound up drawing the line in very different places than the U.S. has. For example, Americans might have trouble imagining a country in which courts can dictate what newspapers and television networks can and cannot say about trials. That's because judges in Canada have determined that the charter guarantee of a fair trial trumps anybody's, quote, right to know. Judges can impose sweeping publication bans. They can even impose bans on reporting that there's been any trial at all, which is sometimes put the Globe and Mail in the peculiar position of running stories that say, we know something we can't tell you, but we can't even tell you why we can't tell you. And lately, the provisions against hate speech have been used in efforts to suppress conflicts with the country's official multiculturalist agenda, or other speech that's politically incorrect. And if there's a pattern, it seems to be that the complainants are frequently Muslims or progressives, and the defendants are frequently Christians or conservatives. You heard the case about Stephen Boisson, the minister who published that horrible letter in the Red Deer Advocate saying that homosexual rights activists and those who defend them are as immoral as pedophiles, and so on. Pretty disgusting. Pretty nauseating. And you heard a lot about that case. What I would like to add is that it took 6 years for the Alberta Human Rights Commission to deliver its verdict, which called for a written apology and called for Mr. Boisson to refrain from ever saying anything bad about homosexuals ever again, as well as a $5,000 fine. And, you know, what he said was nauseating, but did it stifle gay rights? All I can say is we now have gay marriage in this country, and we're a better place for it.